Hi, how's it going? We are back with another lecture. This is 3.6, The Influence of Revolutionary Ideas. And our theme here is social structures. What we're going to be talking about really is the impact of the revolution. We're going to have two learning objectives. The first one is going to deal with the impact at home, and then the second one is going to talk about the impact abroad. And so the social structures that we're looking at are the structures that are created after the revolution. Our first learning objective is explain the various ways the American Revolution affected society. And our first key concept deals with equality. So during and after the American Revolution, an increased awareness of inequalities in societies motivated some individuals and groups to call for the abolition of slavery and greater political democracy in the new state and national governments. So let's talk about slavery first. After the revolution ends, slavery continues. It does not go away despite the revolution being based on ideas of equality. Now, the northern states are going to begin to phase out slavery slowly, and by 1820, most of the northern states, especially New England, they are no longer going to have slavery within their boundaries. However, the southern states, they were starting to think that slavery was on its way out too. They were starting to see a lot less profit from tobacco. Land that was being used for tobacco was now being overexhausted. There were no more nutrients. The price of it had been such that the profit margin on it was not going to be worth it to continue planting tobacco or to buy any more enslaved people in order to continue that cash crop economy. And in 1793, that's going to change with the invention of the cotton gin, and now Southern farmers are going to shift to that crop, and it's going to increase the demand for enslaved people in the new United States. But despite the contributions of Black Americans to the revolution, there was no path to equality set for them. And so here you have a couple of different examples of instances in which Black Americans contributed to the revolution. You can see that they fought side by side with Continental troops. Crispus Attucks, who was killed at the Boston Massacre, was the first casualty of the revolution. And on the far right side, you have a picture of Phyllis Wheatley. She was a enslaved person who became a poet. She was taught how to read and write by the enslavers, and she wrote a lot of poems about equality, praising the revolution, praising George Washington, talking about how slavery was a status that she would not choose to put on anyone else. And she was really holding up a mirror to the rest of America, showing them that while they were talking about equality in this revolution against Britain, they were still taking away liberty from a large group of people. 1/5 of the total population in the States was enslaved. All right, so in terms of greater level of democracy, voting rights are going to be expanded across the state. So every state is going to write its own state constitution. They're going to set their own guidelines for who gets to vote. And white males are going to have near universal suffrage. The property requirements are going to be so low in most states that the majority of white males are going to be able to vote. New Jersey is the only state which allows women to vote. They will allow them to vote from 1776 to 1807. All right, our next key concept is about Republican motherhood. In response to women's participation in the American Revolution, Enlightenment ideas, and women's appeal for expanded roles, an ideal of Republican motherhood gained popularity. It called on women to teach Republican values within the family and granted women and new importance in American political culture. So, women, very much like enslaved people and Black Americans, contributed a lot to the revolution. In the case for women, they took part in boycotts. They were part of groups like the Daughters of Liberty. Some impersonated soldiers and fought alongside the Continental Army. They were maintaining the colonial economy while men were away fighting. And yet, they were not given equal rights at the end of the revolution in the new forms of government. Their consolation prize was this new concept of Republican motherhood. That is, that they were allowed to have a greater level of education, given that they were going to be the ones to teach their sons Republican values because they would grow up to be the next leaders of America. So it's still a largely domestic role. There's no equality guaranteed in these new governments, and it's not by lack of trying. In fact, Abigail Adams had written a letter to her husband during the Revolutionary period in which they are coming up with a new form of government, and she explicitly requests to John Adams to remember the ladies and to not give too much power to the husbands because all men could be tyrants if they could. And so her request went unanswered. At the same time, from England, the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft are being widely read and debated in the new United States. And the book Vindication of the Rights of Women is being read all across the new United States. And it's pushing women for an expanded role in society for equal rights, but they won't get it. All right, then our next learning objective, describe the global impact of the American Revolution, how it impacted other countries abroad. Our key concept here says the American Revolution and the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence reverberated in France, Haiti, and Latin America, inspiring future independence movements. So what it's saying here is that the revolution in America started a domino effect in the Western Hemisphere and then that one country in Europe, France. So France's revolution began in 1789 over the discontent with taxes, the wars that they had been fighting, the poor economy. It ended with King Louis having his head chopped off and France undergoing a reign of terror. Haiti had a revolution of its own. It was established, or it followed the same Enlightenment ideals that the American Revolution followed. It was led by Toussaint Louverture, and it was successful. It was the only successful revolution led by enslaved people. Yet, despite it being based on the same Enlightenment ideals, this was not something that the United States praised. This was actually something that put a lot of fear in the United States because they feared that enslaved people in the United States would try to carry out a similar revolution where there was a lot of slavery. In 1821, Mexico overthrows Spain, and then finally, in the mid-19th century, we have Simón Bolívar leading revolutions all across Latin America, overthrowing the Spanish Empire. All right, that is it. Here's the recap. So you have to remember that slavery continued to be practiced despite the revolutionary ideals of equality. Voting rights were expanded in the new republic. Each state had a different requirement. Women's role in Republican motherhood were still largely domestic. They did not gain legal rights or equal legal rights. And finally, the American Revolution was the first of many. France and Latin America followed. All right, that is it for this lecture. Please make sure to come back for the next one.